If your tribe's fire went out, and you were the one responsible for keeping it alive, some cultures didn't just blame you, they killed you. That's not an exaggeration for effect. In several documented hunter-gatherer and early agricultural societies, the person in charge of maintaining the communal fire carried a responsibility that, if they failed at it, could mean the death of everyone in the group during a hard winter, and the punishment for that failure was treated accordingly, and that's just one candidate for the worst job an ancient human could be assigned. Today we're going through the real contenders, the jobs that anthropologists, historians, and archaeologists have identified as the most brutal, most dangerous, and most thankless roles a person could be handed in a Stone Age or early tribal society. By the end, we'll land on the one that most consistently gets named the worst job of all, and the reason might surprise you because it's not the one involving the most physical danger. Let's get into it. You are 14 years old, and you have just been told, without much ceremony, that you are now responsible for the fire. Not lighting a fire, keeping the fire. This one specific fire, the one at the centre of camp, has been burning continuously for longer than you've been alive. Nobody in your group has struck a spark from flint in years, because they haven't needed to. This fire has been fed, tended, and carried from campsite to campsite, coal by glowing coal, wrapped in bark and moss, for as long as anyone can remember. Your job now is to make sure it never goes out. Not during the day, when you're supposed to be doing a dozen other things. Not at night, when everyone else is asleep, and you're the only one still awake, feeding small pieces of wood into embers, listening to the wind, worried a gust might do in seconds what generations kept alive for years. Not during the 2-day river crossing next month, when you'll have to keep a coal alive inside a hollowed piece of wood while wading through waist-deep water. If you fail, this isn't a private embarrassment. Winter is coming. Fire is warmth. It's protection from predators. It's the only way to cook the food that keeps everyone from starving on raw meat and half-digested plants. If the fire dies, and nobody can relight it fast enough, in the wrong season, in the wrong location, people in your group could die. Not might, could. And everyone around you knows it, which means everyone around you is watching you all the time, waiting to see if you're the reason it happens. So you learn to sleep in fragments, an hour here, half an hour there, always with one ear angled towards the fire pit, always ready to wake at the sound of a hiss that means rain is getting through the shelter you built over the embers. You learn which wood burns clean and which spits and pops in a way that throws sparks where you don't want them. You learn to read the coals themselves, the exact shade of orange that means you have hours left, and the duller, greyer shade that means you need to act now, immediately, or lose everything. Other kids your age get to be careless sometimes. You don't get careless. Carelessness, for you, has a body count attached to it. And you notice something else, something that never quite goes away. Nobody thanks you for a fire that's still burning in the morning. They only notice you when it isn't. Every single day you succeed is invisible. Every day you might fail is the only day anyone will remember. That pressure is why, in several documented societies, the firekeeper's failure wasn't treated as an accident. It was treated as a crime. Before we settle on a winner, let's be honest about the competition, because worst job in an ancient tribe has more contenders than you'd think, and each one is horrifying for a completely different reason. There's the birth attendant, almost always a woman, who assisted deliveries in societies with no anaesthesia, no sterile tools, and maternal mortality rates that modern estimates put as high as 1 in every 20 to 30 births. That's not the mother's risk alone. Attendants who lost mothers or infants during difficult labours were sometimes blamed directly, occasionally accused of witchcraft or sabotage in cultures where death during childbirth was assumed to have a cause beyond biology. There's the persistence hunter, typically a young man tasked with literally chasing prey animals on foot, sometimes for 4 to 6 hours straight, through open heat until the animal collapsed from exhaustion. This technique, still practiced by some groups like the San people of the Kalahari into the 20th century, works because humans can regulate body heat through sweating better than most four-legged animals can. It also means running barefoot across brutal terrain for hours in extreme heat with no guarantee of success, and doing it again a few days later regardless of how your body feels. There's the tanner who processed animal hides into usable leather. There's the firekeeper we just talked about. And there's a fifth candidate that rarely makes these lists, but probably should. The person responsible for testing new food sources. In foraging societies, constantly encountering unfamiliar plants, roots, mushrooms and berries while migrating into new territory, someone had to determine, through direct trial, what was safe to eat and what would kill you. Ethnobotanists studying surviving hunter-gatherer knowledge systems have found this role was sometimes formalised, sometimes informal, but in either case it meant that somebody, at some point, had to eat the unknown plant first, with no way of knowing in advance whether the next hour would bring nothing at all, violent illness or death. All 5 of these are genuinely brutal, each for a completely different reason, but 2 of them, the tanner and the firekeeper, keep coming up again and again in anthropological literature as the roles carrying the worst combination of physical misery, social stigma, and consequence for failure. So let's go deeper on both, then circle back to see how the others stack up. Here's what almost nobody realises about turning an animal hide into usable leather using Stone Age technology. It is one of the most physically disgusting jobs a human being has ever been assigned, and it stayed that way for most of human history. Traditional hide processing, documented across dozens of cultures from prehistoric Europe to indigenous North America, typically required scraping every trace of fat and flesh off the inside of a raw skin, which was already an unpleasant task involving hours of repetitive labour and a smell that clings to skin and clothing for days. But the actual tanning step, the part that turns stiff, rot-prone hide into soft, durable leather, is where it gets worse. One of the most common traditional methods used stale urine as a softening agent because the ammonia in aged urine helps loosen hair and break down proteins in the hide. Another widely documented technique, still used today by traditional brain tanning practitioners, involves working the animal's own brain matter into the hide by hand, a substance that happens to contain the right balance of fats and oils to condition the fibres. Some methods incorporated dung, specifically because certain animal feces contain enzymes useful for softening the material further. Put those 3 things together, stale urine, animal brains, and dung, worked by hand into a rotting piece of flesh in the heat, for hours, day after day, and you start to understand why, in numerous historical societies, the tanning profession carried a smell so persistent and so specific that tanners were often required to live and work on the edge of a settlement, physically separated from everyone else. In medieval Europe centuries later, this separation hardened into outright social stigma. Tanners ranked among the lowest, most looked down upon trades in the entire economy, a stigma that in several documented cultures traces back to practices that predate written history by thousands of years. So the tanner's punishment wasn't death for failure, the way the firekeeper's sometimes was. It was something slower, a permanent social distance, a smell you could never fully wash off, a job nobody wanted, handed disproportionately to people with the least power to refuse it. Here's the question worth actually sitting with. Why would any society organise itself so that these specific jobs, firekeeping, tanning, persistence hunting, birth attendants, existed as distinct assigned roles at all, instead of everyone just sharing the unpleasant work equally? The answer comes down to something anthropologists call division of labour by necessity, and it's older than agriculture, older than permanent settlements, older than almost anything else we associate with organised society. In small hunter-gatherer bands, survival required certain tasks to be done consistently and done well, and consistency required specialisation. A fire that's tended by a different, inexperienced person every single day is far more likely to go out than one maintained continuously by someone who's learned every trick for keeping embers alive through a rainstorm. A hide processed by someone who's done it hundreds of times comes out usable. One processed by a complete beginner might fall apart the first time it gets wet. So these roles got assigned, sometimes by choice, sometimes by circumstance, and sometimes, as anthropological and later historical records repeatedly show, to the people in a group with the least social standing to say no. Younger members, lower status members. In several documented cultures across history, outsiders, captives, or people who had committed some earlier offence against the group were specifically funneled into the least desirable, most physically unpleasant labour, tanning among the most consistently cited examples across continents and centuries. There's also a simpler, more practical reason certain jobs got locked into place early and stayed there. Skill takes time to build, and mistakes in these particular jobs were expensive. A poorly tanned hide wasn't just wasted effort, it represented an entire animal's worth of hunting risk and labour gone to waste, the hours spent tracking, chasing, and killing the animal in the first place, now producing nothing usable. A poorly maintained fire wasn't just an inconvenience, it could mean days of vulnerability while a new one got established. Groups that let anyone attempt these tasks without real skill paid for it in wasted resources they often couldn't afford to lose. So specialisation wasn't just about convenience, it was a survival strategy in its own right, and once someone became the group's tanner or the group's firekeeper, there was little practical incentive to ever let them stop, regardless of how they personally felt about the job. Once a job gets assigned to low-status people, something predictable happens. The job itself starts to carry the same low status. Nobody with options chooses to be the tanner, so the tanner's position gets filled generation after generation from whoever has the least power to refuse it, and the stigma compounds instead of fading. Let's go back to the firekeeper, because this is where the stakes get the most extreme. Ethnographic records from multiple documented hunter-gatherer and early agricultural societies describe fire maintenance as a role with consequences attached that go far beyond disappointment. In several cultures, the person responsible for a fire that went out during a critical period, deep winter, a hunting expedition far from other fire sources, a ritual that required an unbroken flame, faced punishment ranging from severe social humiliation to banishment, and in the most extreme documented cases, execution. That might sound disproportionate until you think through what the failure actually meant before matches, lighters, or reliable friction fire methods that could be executed quickly under bad conditions. Starting a new fire from scratch using a hand drill or bow drill, the primary methods available before more advanced fire starting tools developed, could take anywhere from several minutes to well over an hour, and required dry tinder, the right wood, enough physical strength and stamina to maintain friction long enough to generate an ember, and weather conditions that cooperated. In a driving rainstorm, in deep snow, at high altitude, with wet or frozen materials, that process could fail entirely, sometimes for days. A group without fire in a cold climate isn't inconvenienced, it's in genuine, immediate danger of hypothermia, of being unable to cook food that would otherwise carry parasites or bacteria, of losing the protection fire provided against predators active at night. When the stakes are that binary, keep the fire alive or risk the group's survival, the social contract around firekeeping stopped being casual. It became one of the few jobs in a hunter-gatherer band that came with something close to a death penalty attached to failure. There's one more candidate worth mentioning, because it rarely comes up in these conversations, and that's exactly what makes it worth including. Grave preparation and body handling. Across numerous ancient and tribal cultures, the people responsible for preparing the dead, digging graves, handling bodies, performing burial rites, occupied a strange dual position. In many societies, this role carried spiritual weight and respect, entrusted to specific families or specialists precisely because of how seriously death was taken. But in just as many documented cultures, the opposite was true. Handling the dead was considered spiritually dangerous or ritually contaminating, and the people who did it were treated as temporarily or sometimes permanently unclean. In several cultures across Asia and parts of ancient Europe, this developed into hereditary occupational stigma passed down for generations. Families locked into handling the dead not by individual choice, but by birth, unable to escape a role the rest of society avoided at almost any cost, similar in structure to the stigma faced by tanners. The physical danger was real too. Before embalming and modern preservation, handling decomposing bodies in warm climates carried genuine disease risk, and burial itself, digging through hard ground with primitive tools, was punishing labour performed, disproportionately, by people with no power to refuse the assignment. Let's go back to that fifth candidate for a moment, because it deserves more than a passing mention. As early human groups migrated into new environments, across continents, through radically different climates and ecosystems, they encountered thousands of unfamiliar plants with no existing knowledge attached to them. Modern researchers studying the ethnobotanical knowledge of surviving hunter-gatherer and traditional societies have documented an almost universal pattern. Across wildly different, unconnected cultures on different continents, someone in the group ends up being the one who tries new, potentially edible plants first in small quantities, watching for hours or days afterward for signs of poisoning. Anthropologists studying this pattern have noted it isn't always a dedicated, permanent role the way firekeeping or tanning was. Sometimes it rotated, sometimes it fell to whoever happened to be foraging in a new area first. But in several documented traditional societies, the responsibility for testing unfamiliar food sources was assigned specifically to people with lower status in the group, the same pattern we've already seen with tanning and grave handling. The dangerous, uncertain work slides toward whoever has the least power to refuse it. The psychological weight of this job is worth sitting with. Unlike the firekeeper, who at least understood the danger they were managing, the food taster faced something closer to pure uncertainty. No way to know which plant was the one that would make this the last meal they ever ate, and they had to do it repeatedly every time the group moved into unfamiliar territory, which for a mobile hunter-gatherer band could mean several times a year. So, which one actually deserves the title of worst job in an ancient tribe? The persistence hunter faced brutal, temporary physical extremes, but the role came with high status, since a successful hunter fed and often impressed the entire group. The birth attendant faced devastating consequences when things went wrong, but was frequently one of the most respected, most necessary figures in daily tribal life. The grave handler faced real physical risk, and, in many cultures, deep social stigma, but in others was treated with genuine reverence. The food taster faced pure, repeated uncertainty, with a potentially fatal outcome. But the danger was episodic, not constant, tied to specific moments of migration rather than every single day of the job. The firekeeper and the tanner are different because both combine constant, grinding unpleasantness with almost no way to ever earn status from the role, and both operate every single day, not just at moments of crisis. The firekeeper lived under permanent, low-level psychological pressure every single day for years, with a catastrophic downside if a single bad night went wrong, and virtually no glory attached to simply succeeding, because a fire that stayed lit was invisible. Nobody celebrates the fire that didn't go out. They only notice the one that did. But when you weigh constant physical misery against constant psychological pressure, most anthropologists who've written on this specifically point toward the tanner as the single most consistently miserable, most consistently low-status role across the widest range of documented ancient and tribal cultures. It's a job defined by daily, inescapable physical disgust, urine, rotting flesh, animal brains worked by hand for hours, combined with a social penalty that didn't end when the workday did. The smell followed the tanner home, the stigma followed the tanner's children. And unlike the firekeeper's single catastrophic failure, the tanner's punishment was simply showing up to work every day for an entire lifetime. It's worth seeing how consistently this pattern shows up, because it's not confined to one region or one type of environment. Among traditional Inuit communities of the Arctic, hide and skin processing was frequently women's work, involving hours of chewing sealskin and caribou hide by hand to soften the material, a task so physically demanding that older women who had done it for decades were sometimes noted by early ethnographers as having visibly worn teeth from the repetitive strain, decades of chewing tough, frozen or half-frozen hide until it was workable. Among Aboriginal Australian groups, ethnographers documented fire carrying as a genuinely serious communal responsibility, given how difficult fire starting could be in certain conditions using traditional methods, and the loss of a group's fire during travel through harsh, unfamiliar country carried consequences that went well beyond inconvenience. Among various indigenous groups across North America, tanning was frequently the work of women, performed communally in some nations, but still involving the same unpleasant core process. Hide softened using animal brains, worked for hours by hand, a technique so effective that brain tanning survives today as a specific named skill still taught and practiced by traditional craftspeople. Different continents, different climates, different languages, belief systems and social structures developed independently of each other for tens of thousands of years. And yet the same handful of jobs keep showing up as the ones nobody wanted, handled through the same handful of social mechanisms, assigning the worst of it to whoever had the least standing to refuse. That consistency across cultures with no contact with each other whatsoever is itself one of the more interesting findings in all of this. It suggests these weren't random cultural quirks. They were closer to a predictable, almost mathematical outcome of what happens when small groups of humans need certain miserable jobs done reliably and have to decide, one way or another, who's going to do them. Here's the uncomfortable pattern underneath all of this. In nearly every documented ancient and tribal society, the worst jobs didn't get distributed randomly. They got funneled consistently toward the people with the least power to refuse them. The young, the low status, the outsider, the person born into a family that had done this work for generations before them and had no path out. That pattern didn't end with the Stone Age. It's the same pattern that shaped who mined coal, who worked the worst factory floors during industrialization, and in many parts of the world, it's the same pattern shaping who does the most physically brutal, least desirable labour today. The tools changed completely. The fundamental social mechanism, unpleasant necessary work sliding downhill toward whoever has the least ability to say no, has stayed remarkably consistent for at least 10,000 years. There's also something worth noticing about who got remembered. Archaeology and oral tradition both tend to preserve the story of the great hunter, the respected elder, the skilled toolmaker. The tanner rarely gets a story. The firekeeper who succeeded for 30 consecutive years and never lost a single flame doesn't show up in any surviving legend because success in that role looked like nothing happening at all, and nothing happening doesn't make for a story anyone bothers passing down. We only know these jobs existed because of physical evidence left behind. Tools, hide-working sites identified through microscopic wear patterns, burial pits. Not because anyone thought the people doing this work deserved to be remembered by name. So the next time something at your job genuinely annoys you, it's worth remembering there was, somewhere in your ancestry, someone whose entire life's work involved working animal brains into a rotting hide by hand every single day. while the rest of the tribe kept their distance, or someone lying awake at 2 in the morning, listening to embers, knowing that a single bad night could cost people their lives, and that no one would ever build a monument to the nights nothing went wrong. Whatever's bothering you right now probably doesn't smell as bad, and it almost certainly won't get you exiled.